Dwight David Eisenhower was born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas. He spent his formative years in Abilene, Kansas, growing up as the third of 7 sons in a financially struggling family. Despite his mother's strong adherence to pacifist beliefs as a devout Mennonite, young Ike, as he was affectionately called, defied expectations by earning an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. Graduating in 1915 in the middle of his class, Eisenhower began his military career as a second lieutenant stationed in San Antonio, Texas. It was there that he met Mamie Geneva Doud, whom he married in 1916. The couple welcomed 2 sons, Doud Dwight, who tragically succumbed to scarlet fever in early childhood, and John. World War I concluded just before Eisenhower's planned deployment to Europe, leaving the young officer disappointed. However, he quickly pivoted and secured an appointment to the prestigious Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Excelling in his studies, Eisenhower graduated at the top of his class of 245. He then assumed roles as a military aide, first to General John J. Pershing, the commander of U.S. forces during World War I, and later to General Douglas MacArthur, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Eisenhower's dedication and talent were evident during his 7-year tenure under MacArthur, including a significant posting in the Philippines from 1935 to 1939. Following Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland and the eruption of World War II in Europe, Eisenhower swiftly returned to action. In September 1941, he attained his first general's rank, being promoted to brigadier general. With the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan in December of that year, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington, D.C. to assume the role of a planning officer. Taking charge in November 1942, Eisenhower spearheaded Operation Torch, the triumphant Allied invasion of North Africa. Subsequently, he orchestrated the amphibious assaults on Sicily and the Italian mainland in 1943, culminating in the liberation of Rome in June 1944. Promoted to the rank of full general in early 1943, Eisenhower's career trajectory soared. In December of the same year, he assumed the prestigious role of Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Entrusted with the monumental task of leading the planned Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, Eisenhower bore the weight of immense responsibility. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, over 150,000 Allied troops embarked on a daring assault, storming the beaches of Normandy. This pivotal invasion paved the way for the liberation of Paris on August 25th, ultimately shifting the momentum of the war decisively in favor of the Allies. Eisenhower's meteoric rise from a lieutenant colonel in the Philippines to the supreme commander of victorious forces in Europe within a span of 5 years was nothing short of remarkable. Upon his return home in 1945, he was hailed as a hero and assumed the role of Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. In 1948, Eisenhower transitioned from active military service to become the president of Columbia University in New York City. However, his foray into civilian life was short-lived. In 1950, President Harry S. Truman called upon him to lead the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, forces in Europe. Tasked with this crucial role, Eisenhower dedicated himself to establishing a cohesive military alliance aimed at deterring potential communist threats worldwide. Amidst Truman's dwindling popularity during the Korean War in 1952, prominent Republicans approached Eisenhower, urging him to seek the presidency. Despite encountering some setbacks in the primary elections against the leading Republican contender, Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, Eisenhower made the pivotal decision to step down from his military commission. In June 1952, he returned from his NATO post in Paris, fully committing to his presidential campaign. During the party's national convention in July, Eisenhower clinched the Republican nomination effortlessly on the first ballot, campaigning under the catchy slogan, "I like Ike," and alongside Senator Richard M. Nixon of California as his running mate, Eisenhower secured victory over Adlai Stevenson to assume the role of the 34th President of the United States. Despite health concerns stemming from a heart attack in 1955, Eisenhower decisively defeated Stevenson once more 4 years later, securing his re-election in a landslide victory. Despite facing a Democratic majority in Congress for 6 of his 8 years in office, Eisenhower, known for his moderate Republican stance, achieved numerous legislative triumphs. Continuing the legacies of his predecessors, Franklin Roosevelt and Truman, he bolstered existing New Deal and Fair Deal programs. Notably, he reinforced the Social Security system, raised the minimum wage, and established the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. In a monumental move in 1956, Eisenhower initiated the construction of the Interstate Highway System, a colossal public works endeavor spanning 41,000 miles across the nation. However, Eisenhower's first term was also marked by the tumult of Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist campaign, which trampled civil liberties and culminated in televised hearings in 1954. To maintain party cohesion, Eisenhower refrained from overtly criticizing McCarthy publicly, though he harbored private disdain for the senator. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower worked to diminish McCarthy's influence and ultimately discredit him. Yet Eisenhower's approach to civil rights, particularly for African Americans, was more cautious. Following the landmark 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, which declared school segregation unconstitutional, Eisenhower advocated for a gradual approach to desegregation. Reluctant to assert presidential authority to enforce the court's decision, he nevertheless dispatched federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to ensure the integration of a high school. Despite his reservations, Eisenhower signed civil rights legislation in 1957 and 1960, providing federal safeguards for black voters, marking the first such legislation in the United States. Shortly after assuming office, Eisenhower brokered an armistice to halt the Korean War. Apart from deploying troops to Lebanon in 1958, he refrained from committing further armed forces to active duty throughout his presidency, although he remained steadfast in authorizing defense expenditures. Additionally, Eisenhower sanctioned the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, to execute covert operations against communism globally, including orchestrating regime changes in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. In a pivotal decision in 1954, Eisenhower opted against launching an airstrike to rescue French forces besieged at Dien Bien Phu, thereby averting a conflict in Indochina. Nonetheless, his backing of the anti-communist regime in South Vietnam laid the groundwork for future U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Eisenhower prioritized thawing Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union, particularly following Joseph Stalin's demise in 1953. During a summit in July 1955 in Geneva, Switzerland, Eisenhower proposed an open skies policy, suggesting mutual air inspections of military programs between the United States and the Soviet Union. While the proposal failed to garner Soviet acceptance, it received widespread international endorsement. Faced with the escalating threat of Soviet nuclear capabilities, Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles successfully bolstered NATO and established the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, to counter communist expansion in the region. Despite maintaining relatively amicable relations with the Soviet Union throughout his presidency, highlighted by a summit meeting with Premier Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, Eisenhower's hopes for a treaty were dashed by the Soviet shooting down of a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane in May of 1960, just before his departure from office. In his farewell address in January 1961, Eisenhower voiced concerns about what he termed the military-industrial complex, warning of the potential dangers posed by the collaboration between the military establishment and large corporations. He cautioned that this partnership, driven by the convergence of national defense needs and technological advancements, could unduly influence American governance. Despite Eisenhower's admonitions, the pressures of the Cold War era overshadowed his warnings. Despite facing criticism from both ends of the political spectrum, Eisenhower maintained consistently high approval ratings throughout his tenure. Upon leaving office in January of 1961, he retreated to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he dedicated himself to writing his memoirs. Over the ensuing years, he authored several books before passing away on March 28, 1969, after a prolonged illness.